Hi, my name is Blake Smith, and today I'll be talking about conservation easements. Conservation easements essentially provide a way for landowners in cooperation with conservation agencies to ensure that agricultural land and wildlife habitat remain untouched by commercial development. This can obviously be very important, especially in areas of the country where open space is limited. During this presentation, we'll talk about a few different things. We'll start off by talking about land easements and basically where they come from, how they work, and what they do. From there, we'll talk briefly about where these kinds of easements are more prevalent throughout the country and kind of examine why that might be the case. And finally, toward the end, we'll identify some positives and actually some negatives that might come from these kinds of programs that hold these easements for the sake of conservation. So to start off, we answer the question of what are land easements. When you own a piece of land, essentially you own all of the rights to that land, which include but aren't limited to the right to participate in forestry and agricultural practices, the right to develop the land, whether that's building houses or commercial businesses on it, and the right to restrict access to other people to that property. These aren't the only rights that you have, but it's just a few to list off to kind of give you an idea of where I'm going. The interesting thing is that these rights can be sold individually while still maintaining the overall ownership of the property. The right that is sold in this case is known as an easement, and in the case of conservation easements, especially in agriculture, farmers can often sell or donate the right to develop the land for commercial or residential purposes. These rights are often sold to agencies that specialize in conservation, and it can be either a government agency or a private organization. We'll get into that a little bit more later on when we talk about the different areas of the country where land easements are prominent for the sake of conservation, especially in agriculture. The next question that we're going to look at and try to answer is where are land easements issued and where are they more prominent throughout the country, as well as why might this be the case. Easements, as I said in the previous slide, can be either public or private, and they take place everywhere in all 50 states for various reasons, especially in that private category. But in terms of funded organizations specifically for the purpose of farmland conservation, they aren't as widespread. The map on this slide is a representation of PACE programs throughout the country, which PACE, P-A-C-E, stands for the Purchase of Agricultural Land Easements. So these represent programs throughout the country that are designed to purchase the development rights from agricultural land to ensure that that land stays in agriculture. And it's important that we look at the distribution of these programs throughout the country. A quick explanation of the map. The darker states, the dark green states, are states that have both state-funded and local private programs that participate in the purchasing and development rights. The light green states, the lime green ones, are the states that have only local programs and don't have government-funded programs. And the color green in between are the states that have only state-funded programs. All the tan states are states that don't have the large programs at all for this kind of thing. And if we look at the distribution of these, first of all, you notice that they're all in kind of agricultural areas of the country. And you notice that the northeastern part of the country is very saturated with these programs. And the reason for that is basically that these are areas where the population is growing, it's becoming more dense, but those areas do participate in agriculture. And as the populations grow, land becomes more and more limited, and they don't necessarily have the land to support the growth of agriculture in those areas. So it's very important these programs are put into place in order to prevent the loss of farmland so that we can continue to farm and have agriculture in those areas of the country. If we look a little bit closer at the different states and how their easement programs break down, we see that even the states that have government-funded programs don't necessarily all stack up the same. If we look, these are just a few quick states that I pulled out of a USDA report just to show the differences among them. These are all states that have government programs in place in order to purchase development rights and put farmland into preservation. But you can see that they're definitely not by any means equal. I picked Maryland because it's a nearby state that has done a lot in terms of farmland preservation. in terms of state agencies regulating this sort of thing, the state of Maryland holds over 2,800 easements and has nearly 400,000 acres of protected farmland in preservation. I picked out Connecticut next because, as a close place to my heart, being from Connecticut myself and having farmland in preservation there. And if you look, both the Maryland and Connecticut programs had their inception in the mid to late 70s, and Maryland is obviously leaps and bounds ahead of us in terms of having farmland in preservation. Connecticut holds 321 easements and has a little over 40,000 acres of protected farmland. In another case in Virginia, there aren't as many government programs in place. In Maryland, there are multiple government programs that purchase development rights and put farmland into preservation. In Connecticut, there is kind of one major state-funded one, and in Virginia, there's also one major state-funded one. And it only began purchasing those easements back in 2008, whereas the other two states have had programs around since the mid-'70s. As you see, Virginia has 88 easements held by the government and have just under 20,000 acres of protected farmland by the state itself. So now that I've talked about what easements are and where they're prominent throughout the country, I thought I'd just real quickly go through the pros and cons of these land easements. I think the positive side of things is pretty obvious, as I have up there on the slide. Conservation, conservation, conservation. Especially in parts of the country where land is limited, it's very important that we have these programs in place to ensure that there's land to be farmed by future generations and that we have enough land to support the agriculture in those parts of the country where land is kind of at a premium. On the other side of things, however, ultimately this practice does limit the owner's right to their land, which is the point of the whole thing, but it's a good thing to consider. Land that can't be developed loses value, as you might imagine. And even though a certain percentage of the land that is protected by these easements can be developed for agricultural purposes, they still greatly restrict the farm's ability to expand if they choose to do so. A good example of this is actually my family's farm in Connecticut. The top picture on this slide shows our milking center in about 1995, and the bottom picture is a bird's eye view of what it looks like today. During that time, our herd size has doubled, and we've had to expand our facilities in order just to keep up with our growth. The problem with all of that is that all the land that you see in those pictures is protected by an easement. The development rights have all been bought up by the state, so it took years of legal hassle in order to finally get the barn expansions approved. Eventually, we were able to expand, but as of now, I think we've used up just about all of the allotted land that we have for development. I think we have enough left to build about a small outhouse. And that about wraps up my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.